Picture this. You're a diplomat trying to meet the King of France. But first, you have to get past a woman applying her makeup in public. She's not the Queen, she's the official royal mistress. And here's what will blow your mind. Madame de Pompadour stopped sleeping with Louis XV entirely, kept her position for 14 more years anyway. Why? Because sex was never really the job. The job was running France's shadow government. What you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about power at Versailles. Welcome back to Hearts and History. Tonight we're diving into the strangest job description in European history. Get comfortable, dim those lights, and let this story carry you towards sleep. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We do this every night. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little community spread across the globe. Tonight's story, it's about women who wielded more political power than prime ministers from their bedrooms. A position unlike any other. The Palace of Versailles, 1745. Under those extravagant golden arches and painted ceilings, power games aren't just happening in the throne room. Want to meet King Louis XV? Good luck. Because first you're going to navigate through a cloud of powder and billowing perfumes. There's a woman applying her rouge right there in public. Bold move, right? But here's the thing, she's not just anyone. She's not even just the king's lover. She's something much more dangerous. A position unlike any other. Meet the maîtresse-en-titre, the official royal mistress. And before you roll your eyes thinking this is just some romantic scandal, think again. This isn't about love affairs. This is about a high-ranking government position. Yeah, you heard that right. Government position. She holds her own court, oversees vast income streams, directs political agendas, all from her luxurious apartments that are connected to the king's bedroom by, wait for it, a secret staircase. Because of course there's a secret staircase. A position unlike any other. Think about this for a second. Foreign ambassadors recognize her as a legitimate political player. She's got her own staff, her own budget, her own diplomatic correspondence. The Queen handles the official ceremonies and produces heirs. But this woman, she's the one actually running things, the one the king trusts with state secrets, the one who can make or break a minister's career with a single conversation. It's wild when you realize how formalized this whole thing was. A position unlike any other. Now here's where Madame de Pompadour gets really interesting. Around 1750, she just stopped sleeping with the king, completely. Health problems, exhaustion, whatever the reason, the bedroom door closes. And everyone expects her to disappear, right? Pack up those apartments, wave goodbye to all that power. But Pompadour, she doesn't go anywhere. She transforms herself from lover into something even more valuable. The king's closest advisor, his emotional manager, his political strategist. For 14 more years. A position unlike any other. This is what gets me about this story. Everyone thinks royal mistresses were just about beauty and seduction. But look at what Pompadour actually did after the romance ended. She dismissed ministers who crossed her, shaped France's foreign policy, supported Enlightenment philosophers, commissioned buildings that still stand today. She was essentially running an unofficial second government, and the king, he couldn't function without her. She'd become indispensable, not as a lover, but as the most powerful unofficial advisor in France. A position unlike any other. Let that sink in for a moment. This woman went from bourgeois nobody to shadow prime minister. She outlasted actual prime ministers, survived court conspiracies, maintained her influence through pure political genius. And when she finally died in 1764, Louis XV was devastated, not because he'd lost a former lover, but because he'd lost his most trusted advisor, the person who'd kept him functioning as king for 20 years. That's not leisure, that's not romance, that's pure, exhausting, relentless work. A position unlike any other. The crazy part? This wasn't unique to Pompadour. The position of maîtresse-en-titre had been evolving for decades. Each woman who held it understood something crucial. Physical attraction fades, but political value? That's renewable. That's sustainable. These women turned temporary positions into permanent power bases. They created their own courts within the court, their own networks of influence, their own sources of income. They weren't just mistresses, they were entrepreneurs of influence, a position unlike any other. Here's what's fascinating about studying these women. They operated in a world where official power was completely closed to them. Queens were foreigners chosen for diplomatic marriages. Regular noblewomen had no political voice, but the king's mistress? She could shape policy, influence wars, protect artists and philosophers, commission architecture. It was maybe the only way a woman could wield real political power in 18th century France. And some of them, they wielded it brilliantly, for decades, a position unlike any other. So the next time someone tells you about royal mistresses like they were just scandalous love affairs, you'll know better. These women were running shadow governments, managing foreign policy, keeping kings functional. It was a tireless quest for power and influence, disguised as romance. And what we're about to explore together is how the most powerful women in France turned the king's bedroom into the unofficial centre of European politics. Sweet dreams are made of political intrigue, right? The political logic. Here's what nobody tells you about French royal marriages. They weren't marriages at all. They were business mergers, treaties with legs. A French king would wake up one morning and discover he's marrying some Austrian archduchess he's never met, or a Spanish infanta who doesn't speak French, or a Polish princess who's already homesick before she arrives. The wedding? Pure ceremony. The honeymoon? Awkward diplomatic small talk, and everyone just expected this to work somehow. Picture Louis XV at 15, married to Marie Antoinette. She's 22. Polish, speaks broken French. They have nothing in common except the crown's expectation that they'll produce heirs and secure the alliance with Poland. No shared interests, no inside jokes, no real conversation beyond court pleasantries. This wasn't love, this was duty with a crown on top, and this is supposed to sustain a marriage for decades. France figured out pretty quickly it couldn't. So the French court developed what you might call a solution. The king needs someone to actually talk to, someone who gets his jokes, someone who can challenge his ideas without worrying about diplomatic incidents, someone who chose to be there, not someone assigned by treaty. Enter the mistress. Not just any mistress, the official mistress, the maîtresse-en-titre. This wasn't scandal, this was system, practical, almost bureaucratic. The queen handled one job, the mistress handled everything else. The queen's job description? Straightforward, produce male heirs, attend state functions, look regal, represent the alliance your marriage created, smile during ceremonies, don't cause diplomatic problems. That's pretty much it. Everything emotional, intellectual, creative, or genuinely personal. That fell to the mistress. She was the king's actual companion, his confidante, his entertainment committee, therapist and best friend rolled into one. The queen got the crown, the mistress got the king. And here's the thing that shocked me when I first learnt this. The queens often didn't mind. Marie Antoinette actually seemed relieved when Louis XV found Pompadour. Less pressure on her to be someone she wasn't. Less expectation to magically connect with this foreign king she'd been shipped off to marry. She could focus on her actual interests, her prayer books, her charitable works, her quiet life. The mistress absorbed all the emotional labour she was frankly not equipped for. Think about it from the king's perspective. You're the absolute monarch of France. Every decision you make affects millions of lives. You can't trust most people, they want something from you. Your council tells you what they think you want to hear. Your courtiers flatter you constantly. Your wife is nice enough, but you were strangers when you married. You're still strangers 20 years later. Who do you actually confide in? Who tells you the truth? The mistress. She's the only person who chose you. The mistress became the king's reality check, his emotional anchor, the person who could say, "That's a terrible idea," without getting executed. She managed his moods, his depression, his boredom. She organized his entertainment, filtered his social interactions, even helped manage other parts of his love life. This wasn't just about romance. This was about having one person in your life who was genuinely personally invested in your well-being. Not your kingdom's well-being, yours. Other European courts had mistresses. Sure, but they were unofficial, hidden, scandalous. France said, "You know what? Let's just make this legitimate. Give her apartments in the palace. A title, a budget, diplomatic recognition." Foreign ambassadors knew they had to court the mistress's favour to reach the king. She wasn't the king's dirty secret. She was his chief of staff with benefits. It was brilliant, actually. Practical. Distinctly French. The English called it immoral. The Spanish were horrified. The Germans whispered about French decadence. But you know what those courts didn't have? Stable, long-term royal relationships where the king actually seemed happy. Their kings were miserable with their diplomatic wives, sneaking around with random courtiers, causing constant scandal and instability. France created a system that acknowledged human nature instead of pretending duty alone could sustain a life. It worked for centuries. This wasn't about the king being selfish or immoral. This was about recognizing that absolute power is incredibly isolating, that diplomatic marriages leave enormous emotional voids, that kings, despite the crown, are still human beings who need genuine connection. The official mistress filled that void systematically, professionally. She was part therapist, part advisor, part companion. The queen handled the crown's needs. The mistress handled the man wearing it. So how did you get this job? How did you catch the attention of the most powerful man in France and convince him you were worth disrupting the entire court for? That's where things get really interesting, because becoming the king's official mistress wasn't something that just happened. It was strategic, calculated, sometimes planned for years, and the competition, absolutely ruthless. Noble families would literally groom their daughters for this position. The application process. Picture this. You're a noble family in 18th century France, and you've got a brilliant, beautiful daughter. There's one job opening that could change your entire bloodline's fortune forever. But here's the thing. You can't exactly submit a resume for the position of royal mistress. There's no job posting, no interview process, just a series of carefully orchestrated moments where everything has to align perfectly. One glance, one conversation, one perfectly timed entrance could make or break everything. The hunting grounds at Versailles, the weekly balls in the Hall of Mirrors, private theatrical performances in the royal chambers. These weren't just entertainment, they were auditions. Every eligible woman at court knew it. When Louis XV announced a hunt, suddenly half the noble ladies developed a passionate interest in riding. When the king attended the opera, the boxes filled with France's most accomplished young women, all strategically positioned, all hoping for that one crucial moment of eye contact. But you couldn't just show up and hope for the best. You needed an intermediary, someone already close to the king who could make introductions. The Duc de Richelieu was notorious for this. He'd spot promising candidates and arrange seemingly casual encounters. These matchmakers held incredible power. They could make or destroy a family's ambitions with a single recommendation, and they expected to be rewarded handsomely if their introduction led to a royal romance. It was a business, pure and simple. The planning started years in advance. Noble families studied the king's preferences like scholars. They noted which type of woman caught his attention, what subjects interested him in conversation, even what colours he seemed drawn to. Then they'd groom their daughters accordingly. Extra music lessons, dancing masters, language tutors. Some families spent fortunes preparing their girls for a chance encounter that might never come. But if it did, one successful daughter could elevate an entire bloodline to untold wealth and influence. The competition was absolutely vicious. Court ladies would sabotage each other's chances without hesitation, spreading rumours about rivals, arranging for awkward interruptions during promising conversations. One woman might accidentally spill wine on another's gown just before the king arrived. The Duchesse de Charteroux once had a competitor's invitation to a royal hunt mysteriously disappear. These weren't games, careers and family fortunes hung in the balance. Only the most cunning survived this arena of silk and daggers. Beauty alone wasn't enough. Sure, you needed to be stunning, but half the women at Versailles were gorgeous. The king had seen every type of conventional beauty imaginable. What caught his eye was something distinctive. Maybe unusual colouring, an expressive face that registered every emotion, grace that seemed effortless. Pompadour wasn't the most classically beautiful woman at court, but she had this luminous quality that made you forget everyone else in the room. That's what you needed, something that lingered in memory. Intelligence was absolutely crucial. Louis XV got bored easily, incredibly easily. He needed mental stimulation as much as physical attraction. Aspiring mistresses studied philosophy, literature, current events, art. They learned to discuss military strategy and foreign policy. Some could debate Voltaire's latest work or explain the finer points of Baroque architecture. The king wanted a companion who could match his intellect, not just someone pretty to look at. Stupid beauties might catch his eye, but they never kept his attention for long. Conversational skill separated the amateurs from the professionals. You had to know when to speak and when to listen, how to ask questions that drew him out without seeming nosy, how to disagree charmingly without challenging his authority. Madame de Pompadour mastered this completely. She could make the king laugh, think, and feel understood all in one conversation. She knew exactly when to be witty and when to be serious, when to be vulnerable and when to be strong. It was like psychological chess, played at lightning speed. Everything had to appear natural and spontaneous. But behind every chance encounter was months of careful planning, timing your entrance to the salon, wearing the right dress in the right colour, positioning yourself where the king would notice you without seeming obvious about it. One woman spent weeks learning the king's favourite piece of music just so she could happen to be playing it when he passed by. Every glance, every smile, every seemingly casual conversation was choreographed like a ballet. The best candidates made it look effortless. Smart families studied the king's moods and interests obsessively. When Louis XV developed a passion for astronomy, suddenly every eligible daughter knew the constellations. When he showed interest in new architectural styles, they'd casually mention their thoughts on the latest building projects. You had to become whatever might intrigue him that particular season. But here's the trap. You couldn't be obvious about it. If the king sensed you were performing rather than genuinely interested, you were finished. Authenticity within artifice. It was an impossible balance most women never mastered. The final test was whether you could handle the approach itself. When the king showed interest, panic was fatal. Some women froze completely. Others became so nervous they babbled nonsense. The winners stayed composed while their entire world shifted beneath their feet. They could carry on intelligent conversation while knowing that every word might determine their family's future. It took nerves of absolute steel, because once the king's attention focused on you, there was no room for mistakes. You had one chance to prove you belonged in his world. The job benefits. Picture getting a job offer so good it sounds like a complete fairy tale. Free palace apartment? Check. Secret staircase to your boss's bedroom? Check. Annual salary that could buy a small country? Double check. Welcome to the benefits package of being France's official royal mistress. We're talking about wealth that made millionaires look poor, real estate that included actual palaces, and jewellery collections worth more than most kingdoms' treasuries. The perks were so outrageous they'd make modern billionaires jealous. This wasn't just employment, this was complete transformation into royalty itself. Let's start with housing. Your new apartment wasn't just at Versailles, it was connected directly to the king's private chambers. Secret staircases, hidden doorways, you could walk from your bedroom to his without anyone seeing you. These weren't guest quarters, these were state apartments with marble floors, painted ceilings, silk wallpaper, and windows overlooking the gardens. Rooms so grand that foreign ambassadors would meet with you there instead of going through official channels. Your address was literally the most powerful building in Europe, the ultimate corner office with benefits. But here's where it gets insane. Louis XV bought Madame de Pompadour an entire palace. Not just any palace, the Élysée. Yes, that Élysée. The building that's now the French president's official residence. He purchased it as a gift for his mistress. Think about that for a second. Your boyfriend buys you the equivalent of the White House just because he feels like it. The paperwork alone must have been incredible. Purpose of purchase. Romantic gesture. The Élysée Palace was Pompadour's private getaway home, her weekend house, casual Tuesday residence. The income was absolutely staggering. We're talking about annual allowances that exceeded the budgets of entire provinces, plus gifts, constantly, not flowers and chocolates, estates, titles, land grants, monopolies. Pompadour received enough money to fund her own army if she wanted. The treasury records show payments so large that ministers worried about national bankruptcy, and this was just her regular salary. The bonus gifts? Those came whenever Louis felt generous, which was often. The woman had more spending money than most European kings had in their entire treasuries. The jewellery collection alone could blind you. Literally, contemporary accounts describe diamonds covering her neck, ears, wrists, and fingers during court appearances. Necklaces worth more than castles, earrings that cost more than small villages, ruby bracelets, emerald tiaras, pearl everything. Her jewellery box was essentially a national treasure vault. Foreign diplomats would stare. Other nobles would calculate the value in their heads and give up counting. Dubarry once wore so many diamonds to a state dinner that candlelight reflecting off her gems lit up the entire room. Your family got the royal treatment too. Brothers suddenly found themselves with military commissions and government posts. Fathers received titles they never earned. Mothers got presented at court like they'd been nobility forever. The mistress's relatives went from middle-class obscurity to aristocratic prominence overnight. Pompadour's brother became a duke. Her friends received pensions. Her hairdresser got wealthy. Even the servants in her household lived better than most nobles. Being connected to the maîtresse-en-titre was like winning the lottery, except the lottery kept paying out for decades. The living spaces were pure fantasy. Halls adorned with paintings commissioned from the greatest artists in Europe, frescoes on every ceiling, furniture crafted by master artisans, silk tapestries imported from China, crystal chandeliers that took teams of servants to maintain. Your breakfast room had better artwork than most museums. The windows looked out onto manicured gardens designed by landscape architects who normally only worked for kings. Every surface was precious metal, rare wood, or priceless fabric. Walking through these apartments was like touring a living museum of luxury. The real estate portfolio kept growing. Estates scattered across France, chateaux with their own villages attached, hunting lodges for weekend getaways, townhouses in Paris, summer retreats in the countryside. Each property came with its own staff, its own budget, its own local authority. Pompadour owned so much land that she needed managers to keep track of it all. Maps showing her holdings looked like a small kingdom. Some of these estates were larger than the territories ruled by German princes. She was essentially a feudal lord with better jewellery, but the real perk was access. Want to meet the king? You had to go through her first. Foreign ambassadors paid their respects to her before requesting royal audiences. Ministers sought her approval for policy proposals. She read state correspondence. She influenced military appointments. She had her own diplomatic channels with foreign courts. Other European rulers wrote to her directly, not to the Queen, to the mistress. She was essentially running a parallel government from her apartment. Political power that made prime ministers nervous. That's not a mistress, that's a shadow ruler. Compare this to what regular French people had in the 1750s. Most families lived in single rooms, shared wells for water, no glass windows, diet of bread and cabbage if they were lucky. Meanwhile, the king's mistress had heated marble floors, private orchestras, chefs preparing delicacies, and enough wealth to feed entire provinces. The contrast was obscene. While peasants struggled to survive harsh winters, she complained about which silk dress to wear to tonight's private concert. The gap between her lifestyle and normal life wasn't just inequality, it was different planets. So yeah, the benefits package was slightly ridiculous. Secret palace apartments, unlimited spending money, a jewellery collection worth kingdoms, family members elevated to nobility, the president's house as a casual gift, and enough political power to shape European foreign policy. Not bad for a position that officially didn't exist. No wonder ambitious women spent their entire lives manoeuvring for this role. The maîtresse-en-titre didn't just live like royalty. In many ways, she had more freedom and power than the actual queen. The ultimate job with benefits that redefined what benefits could be. The real responsibilities. Here's what nobody tells you about being the king's official mistress. It wasn't just about looking pretty and showing up for dinner. These women essentially ran a shadow government. They were expected to be political advisors, emotional therapists, party planners, and intelligence officers, all rolled into one. Think about that for a second. While the Queen was busy producing heirs and attending ceremonial functions, the maîtresse-en-titre was actually governing France. The job description was insane. First responsibility, political advisor. Foreign ambassadors knew they had to go through the king's mistress to get anything done. She read state papers, attended private council meetings, and shaped foreign policy. Pompadour literally dismissed ministers she didn't like. D'Aubary influenced France's stance on international conflicts. These women weren't decorative. They were running the country behind closed doors. The Queen handled ceremonies. The mistress handled actual governance. Wild when you think about it. Then there was the emotional management. French kings were complicated. Louis XV suffered from what we'd now call clinical depression. Constant melancholy, mood swings, crushing boredom. Guess whose job it was to fix that? The mistress had to keep him mentally stable enough to rule. Contemporary accounts describe Pompadour literally running herself ragged, trying to keep Louis entertained. She organised elaborate theatricals, planned surprise getaways, commissioned new buildings, anything to lift his spirits. Court faction management was equally brutal. Versailles was a snake pit of competing noble families, each trying to gain royal favour. The mistress had to navigate these alliances without making deadly enemies. Support the wrong minister, political suicide, ignore the right duchess, social warfare. These women were essentially playing three-dimensional chess, where one wrong move could destroy their family's fortune and their own life. The pressure must have been crushing. Entertainment planning sounds fun until you realise the stakes. The king expected constant diversions, balls, concerts, theatrical performances, hunting parties, card games, new art projects. Pompadour personally organised private theatricals where she acted alongside professional performers. She commissioned operas, planned garden parties, supervised construction projects, all to keep one man from getting bored, because a bored king was a dangerous king who might make impulsive political decisions. Managing the monarch's state of mind was the most delicate part. Kings couldn't show weakness publicly, so the mistress became their private emotional outlet. She absorbed their fears, doubts, and frustrations. She had to know when to push and when to back off, when to offer advice and when to just listen. Basically, she was a royal therapist without any training, dealing with someone whose mental health affected an entire nation. Here's the really dangerous part. The mistress was often the only person who could deliver bad news to the king. Military defeats, financial crises, public unrest. Ministers were too scared to tell the king unpleasant truths. So that job fell to his lover. She had to figure out how to break devastating news without triggering royal rage or depression. Talk about walking on eggshells. One wrong word could mean exile or worse. This made them both trusted allies and valuable informants. The mistress knew state secrets, heard private conversations, and witnessed the king's unguarded moments. Foreign spies tried to bribe them for information. Rival courtiers sought their favour. They became walking treasure troves of political intelligence. But that also made them targets. Everyone wanted something from them, and everyone was watching their every move for signs of advantage. The workload was honestly exhausting. Contemporary accounts describe these women working 18-hour days, morning audiences with petitioners, afternoon political meetings, evening entertainments that lasted until dawn, plus managing their own households, correspondence with foreign courts, and personal relationships. Pompadour literally worked herself to death by age 42. The stress of keeping an absolute monarch happy while running a shadow government broke most of them. Louis XV was particularly difficult. Palace records show Pompadour organising elaborate masked balls, commissioning new buildings just to give him something to focus on, even arranging private concerts with famous performers. When he got bored with Versailles, she'd plan trips to other chateaux. When those got old, she'd start renovation projects, anything to keep his mind occupied. The man required constant stimulation, and providing it nearly killed her. The pressure never stopped. Even in private moments, they were performing, making sure the king stayed content, politically engaged, and emotionally stable, because if he fell apart, France fell apart. These women carried the psychological weight of an entire kingdom on their shoulders. No wonder most of them aged rapidly, suffered health problems, and died young. The job was literally impossible, but somehow they managed it for decades. The hierarchy of lovers. Picture this. You're at Versailles and you need to understand who's who in the king's romantic life. Because there was a whole system, a pecking order, and it wasn't just about who looked prettier or who caught his eye that week. This was serious politics wrapped up in silk gowns and secret glances. At the very top sat the maîtresse-en-titre, the official mistress. But beneath her, a whole network of lesser lovers, each with their own place, their own hopes, their own schemes. The maîtresse-en-titre wasn't just the king's favourite. She was the queen of the shadow court. Official apartments, annual salary, her own staff, foreign ambassadors treated her like royalty because, well, she basically was. Madame de Pompadour held this title for 19 years. Think about that. She outlasted wars, political upheavals, multiple ministers. When diplomats wanted to influence French policy, they didn't just meet with the king, they courted his official mistress. She was the gatekeeper to the most powerful man in Europe. But here's where it gets complicated. Below the official mistress were the petite maîtresses, the minor affairs, no official recognition, no apartments, no salary, just the king's temporary attention, and whatever gifts he felt like giving. These women lived in limbo. Not quite nobodies, but definitely not somebodies either. They'd catch Louis XV's eye at a ball, maybe get a few months of his interest, then nothing. Back to regular court life, left with memories, and maybe some expensive jewellery if they were lucky. And this is the wild part. The king often kept both levels running simultaneously. While Pompadour held her official position, Louis XV was still having his little side affairs. It wasn't exactly cheating on his mistress, because everyone understood the arrangement. The official mistress knew about the petite maîtresses. The petite maîtresses knew they weren't the main event. It was like a royal harem, but with French etiquette and way more passive aggression. Everyone smiled. Everyone played their part. Everyone quietly hated each other. The most exhausting job, being the maîtresse-en-titre and having to manage all these minor affairs. Pompadour wasn't just keeping the king happy, she was managing his entire romantic ecosystem. New girl catches his eye. Pompadour had to decide if she was a threat or just a distraction. Too beautiful and ambitious. Problem. Too clingy. Bigger problem. The official mistress became like a talent scout, HR manager, and damage control specialist all rolled into one. Talk about job responsibilities that weren't in the original description. Every time the king showed interest in someone new, it triggered what courtiers called the delicate dance. Picture this. Louis XV makes eye contact with some pretty young thing at a court function. Word spreads instantly. The current petite maîtresses start panicking. The maîtresse-en-titre starts calculating. The girl's family starts scheming. And everyone at court starts picking sides and placing bets. It was like high school drama, but with the fate of French foreign policy hanging in the balance. These weren't just romantic relationships, they were power moves. Every declaration of affection from the king shifted the political landscape at Versailles. Families would bankrupt themselves educating and dressing their daughters, hoping to catch royal attention, because one night in the king's bed could translate to land grants, government positions, or military commissions for the whole family. The hierarchy of lovers was really a hierarchy of political influence. Sex was just the entry fee to the real game, which was power. The maîtresse-en-titre had to be part diplomat, part therapist, part prison warden. When du Barry arrived on the scene in the 1760s, she wasn't just Louis XV's new favourite. She was a threat to every established power structure at court. Pompadour was dead by then, but the system remained. Du Barry had to navigate the same treacherous waters, managing the king's moods, while fending off rivals who wanted her gone. The difference? Du Barry didn't have Pompadour's political instincts. She was all passion, no strategy. The petite maîtresses lived in constant hope and fear. Hope that they'd be elevated to official status. Fear that they'd be discarded for someone younger or prettier. They'd spend fortunes on gowns, hoping to catch the king's eye again. They'd study his moods, trying to time their approaches perfectly. Most burned through their family's money, chasing a dream that almost never materialized. For every Pompadour who rose to the top, there were dozens of forgotten women who gambled everything on royal affection and lost. The hierarchy created its own weird etiquette. How do you curtsy to your rival? How do you make small talk with the woman who's sleeping with the man you want? Court observers wrote about the subtle warfare, the strategic positioning at dinner parties, the calculated compliments that were really insults, the way information flowed or was withheld based on your position in the romantic pecking order. Versailles had rules for everything, including how to hate someone politely while competing for the same man. What strikes me most about this whole system is how exhausting it must have been for everyone involved. The king juggling multiple relationships, the official mistress managing palace intrigue, the minor mistresses competing for scraps of attention, even the queen trying to maintain dignity while her husband's love life played out in public. It was a house of cards built on desire, ambition, and political necessity. And like most houses of cards, it eventually came crashing down when the revolution decided enough was enough. Pompadour's prophecy. Paris, 1730s. 9-year-old Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson sits across from a fortune teller in a cramped parlour. The woman studies her palm, traces the lines with a weathered finger, Then she speaks words that will change everything. You will be loved by a king, not married to one, loved by one. The little bourgeois girl stares back, wide-eyed. Her mother's breath catches. This isn't some vague prediction about happiness or wealth. This is specific, dangerous, and in the rigid world of 18th century France, seemingly impossible. Think about what this meant. A king's love in France wasn't some fairy tale romance. It was a political position. Real power, real influence. But Jean Antoinette was bourgeois, middle class. Her father sold grain and fish. In the world of Versailles, that might as well have made her invisible. Kings didn't notice girls like her. They married foreign princesses and took mistresses from ancient noble families. Yet here's this fortune teller, looking at this child's palm and seeing what exactly? Something that would echo through French history. Her mother, Madeleine, becomes obsessed with this prophecy. She doesn't dismiss it as nonsense. She doesn't laugh it off. Instead, she starts planning. If her daughter is destined to capture a king's heart, then by God, she'll be ready for it. This becomes the family mission. Every decision, every expense, every choice gets filtered through one question. Will this help Jean Antoinette catch a king? It's a massive gamble. They're betting their entire fortune on the word of a street fortune teller. But sometimes the impossible happens. The education begins immediately. Not the typical bourgeois girl's training in household management and basic reading. No, Jean Antoinette gets the full aristocratic treatment. Private tutors for everything. Languages, literature, history, philosophy. She needs to be able to hold conversations with diplomats and ministers, to discuss poetry with equal skill as politics. Because if you're going to compete with duchesses and countesses for royal attention, you can't just be pretty, you have to be brilliant, fascinating, unforgettable, and that takes serious preparation. Music becomes her specialty. Not just learning to play, learning to enchant. The harpsichord, the clavichord, singing lessons with the best teachers money can buy. She studies under masters, who normally only taught nobility. Her family is hemorrhaging money on this dream, but they're committed. She learns to sing like an angel, to play with such skill that even jaded court musicians pay attention, because music was the language of seduction at Versailles, and Jean Antoinette is becoming fluent. Then comes the art of conversation. This might sound simple, but it's not. Court conversation was like chess, every word calculated, every pause strategic. She learns wit without cruelty, intelligence without intimidation, charm without desperation, how to listen in ways that make people feel important, how to disagree without giving offence, how to be memorable without being scandalous. These aren't natural talents, they're learned skills, and Jean Antoinette is becoming a master student of human nature itself. The family's commitment is staggering. They're essentially creating an aristocrat from scratch. Dancing masters teach her every court dance. Painting instructors develop her artistic eye. Even her posture gets refined. How to sit, how to walk, how to enter a room like she belongs there. They're not just educating her, they're transforming her into someone who could stand next to a countess and seem equally noble. It's an expensive, exhausting process, but the prophecy drives them forward. What if it's true? Years pass. Jean Antoinette blossoms into exactly what her family hoped. Beautiful, yes, but that's just the foundation. She's developed this magnetic intelligence that draws people in. Conversations with her feel different, more alive, more interesting. She has opinions about art, politics, literature. She can discuss philosophy or gossip with equal skill. She's become the kind of woman who makes rooms brighter just by entering them. The fortune teller's words echo in everyone's mind. Loved by a king. Maybe it wasn't so impossible after all. But here's what strikes me about this whole story. The iron will involved. Think about the pressure on this girl. Every day, every lesson, every social interaction is preparing for one specific destiny. She can't just be good at things, she has to be exceptional. Because when your moment comes to catch a king's eye, you don't get a second chance. One conversation, one dance, one opportunity to prove that all those years of preparation were worth it. That kind of pressure would break most people. Instead, it forged Jeanne Antoinette into something remarkable. The prophecy starts feeling less like fantasy and more like destiny. By her early 20s, Jeanne Antoinette has become someone who could plausibly capture royal attention. She moves in circles where she might actually encounter the king. The fortune teller's words don't seem crazy anymore. They seem possible. And in 1745, at a masked ball celebrating the marriage of the king's son, those words will finally come true. But that's the next part of her story. For now, understand this. She didn't stumble into power. She was methodically prepared for it. What gets me about Pompadour's story is how it perfectly captures something about ambition and destiny. Was the fortune teller genuinely psychic? Or did the prophecy create its own reality? By believing she was destined for greatness, her family gave her the tools to achieve it. The education, the confidence, the preparation, maybe that's all prophecy really is. Seeing potential and then doing everything necessary to fulfill it. Either way, that little bourgeois girl sitting in a Paris parlour would become the most powerful woman in France. Sometimes the impossible just needs the right preparation. The Masked Ball, February 1745. Versailles is buzzing with anticipation. The Dauphin's wedding to the Spanish Infanta calls for the most spectacular celebration in years. And tonight's the Masked Ball everyone's been whispering about for months. Hundreds of courtiers in elaborate costumes, their identities hidden behind silk masks and feathers. The perfect stage for secrets, flirtations, and, well, history in the making. Jeanne Antoinette Poisson knows this is her moment. She's 23, beautiful, and she's been preparing for this night her entire life. See, this isn't just any party. Royal weddings mean political alliances, and political alliances mean everyone's watching everyone else. Foreign ambassadors mixed with French nobility, all trying to read the room while hiding behind masks. The king himself will be there, of course. Louis XV, 35 years old, married to a queen he barely tolerates, surrounded by courtiers who tell him what they think he wants to hear. But tonight, with everyone masked, tonight, normal rules don't apply. Tonight, anyone could approach the king. Pompadour's costume choice. Pure genius. Diana the Huntress. Flowing white silk, silver bow, crescent moon crown. But here's the brilliant part. This isn't random. 2 months earlier, she'd encountered Louis XV during a royal hunt in the forest of Senart. He'd noticed her then, riding alongside his party. Now she's literally dressing as the goddess of the hunt. The symbolism is impossible to miss. She's not just wearing a costume, she's wearing a reminder of their first meeting, wrapped in mythology. Think about that strategy for a second. Everyone else is playing it safe, with generic mythological figures, or historical characters. Pompadour. She's telling a story. Her costume whispers, "Remember me? Remember the hunt? Remember how I caught your attention?" It's personal mythology wrapped in silk and silver. She's transformed herself into the goddess who first captured his gaze in the forest. This isn't just fashion. This is psychological warfare disguised as party wear, and it's about to work perfectly. The ball begins at 10. Chandeliers blazing, musicians tuning up in the gallery, couples swirling across the polished floors, the air thick with perfume, whispered conversations, and political tension. Behind every mask, someone's calculating their next move. Louis XV enters, wearing a simple black domino, completely unremarkable, except for one detail. He keeps scanning the crowd, searching. His eyes stop on Diana. Even across a crowded ballroom, even behind a mask, he recognizes her immediately. The huntress has found her prey. What happens next breaks every rule of court etiquette. The king doesn't send an intermediary, doesn't signal a courtier to make introductions. He walks directly to Pompadour himself, cutting through the crowd like everyone else is invisible. Whispered conversations stop mid-sentence. Heads turn. This never happens. Kings don't pursue. Kings are pursued. But Louis XV is walking straight toward Diana the Huntress, like he's under some kind of spell. Maybe he is. Maybe that's exactly what she's counting on. They dance, not once, but 3 times, in full view of everyone. The king's attention fixed entirely on this mysterious huntress, while his wife, the queen, watches from across the room. Court gossips are practically vibrating with excitement. Who is she? Why is he so obviously smitten? Then comes the moment that changes everything. Mid-conversation, Louis XV reaches up and removes his mask. In public, in front of everyone. The King of France just revealed his identity to a woman nobody recognizes. The ballroom goes silent. You could hear silk rustling. This is unprecedented. Shocking. Scandalous. Kings don't unmask themselves for anyone except other royalty. But Louis XV just tossed protocol out the window for a woman in a Diana costume. The message couldn't be clearer. I choose you. I claim you. I don't care who's watching. Pompadour keeps her mask on, playing her part perfectly, but inside, she knows she's won. The fortune-teller's prophecy from her childhood is coming true. The political implications hit the room like a thunderclap. Wives of courtiers exchange glances. Ministers start calculating. Foreign ambassadors take mental notes for their dispatches. This isn't just the king flirting. This is the king declaring interest. Public interest, which means someone new is about to gain access to the most powerful man in France. Someone outside the established court families. Someone nobody saw coming. The balance of power at Versailles just shifted in the span of a single dance. Within weeks, Pompadour is living at Versailles. Apartments prepared, wardrobe commissioned, presentation to the Queen arranged. The masked ball wasn't just a party. It was her job interview, and she passed with flying colours. But here's what nobody realises yet. This woman who caught the king's eye with a costume and clever conversation. She's about to transform the position of royal mistress from romantic companion into something unprecedented, the unofficial Prime Minister of France. That masked ball is still talked about centuries later. Not because of the dancing or the costumes or even the scandal, but because it marked the beginning of something extraordinary. 20 years of influence. 20 years of shaping French politics from the king's bedroom. 20 years of proving that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't wearing a crown. They're wearing a carefully chosen costume and the confidence to remove the king's mask in front of everyone. Managing the melancholy king. Here's what nobody tells you about being the most powerful mistress in France. It was exhausting, like soul-crushingly exhausting. Madame de Pompadour didn't just have to look beautiful and say witty things. She had to become Louis XV's personal entertainment director, therapist and mood manager, all rolled into one. The king suffered from what we'd probably call depression today, dark moods that could last for weeks. And guess whose job it was to snap him out of it? Every single time. Louis XV wasn't some cheerful monarch who occasionally got a bit down. This was a man plagued by what courtiers delicately called frequent bouts of melancholy. He'd sink into these black moods where he barely spoke, barely ate, barely functioned as a king. And Pompadour, she had to pull him out. Every time. With a smile on her face and a new plan up her sleeve. Contemporary accounts describe her literally running herself ragged, trying to keep this man happy. Think about that pressure for a second. So what did this actually look like? Picture an endless carousel of entertainment. Private theatrical performances in the palace. Surprise getaways to different chateaux. Elaborate balls with hundreds of guests. intimate concerts featuring the best musicians in Europe, hunting parties, card games, art projects, construction projects, garden redesigns. Pompadour was basically running a full-time entertainment company with one very demanding client who happened to control the most powerful nation in Europe. And if he got bored, that was her fault. Her problem to solve. The private theatricals alone were insane. Pompadour didn't just arrange these shows, she starred in them. She'd spend weeks learning new roles, rehearsing with professional actors, designing costumes, coordinating sets, all to give Louis XV maybe 2 hours of distraction from whatever was eating at him that week. Then it was on to the next thing, maybe a surprise trip to Choisy, or Bellevue, or Crazy. Each residence had to be perfectly prepared, perfectly staffed, perfectly entertaining. The logistics alone would break most people. And here's what gets me. She couldn't show how tired she was, ever. Court observers wrote about how Pompadour maintained this facade of effortless grace while secretly orchestrating this massive operation behind the scenes. She'd be up until 3 in the morning planning tomorrow's entertainment, then appear at breakfast looking radiant and ready for whatever mood Louis was in. The woman was running on fumes and French determination, but everyone just saw the glamorous mistress living her best life. The pressure was unreal, because if Louis got depressed, if he retreated into one of his dark moods, the entire government basically ground to a halt. Ministers couldn't get appointments, foreign ambassadors waited for weeks, important decisions got delayed, so Pompadour wasn't just managing her boyfriend's feelings, she was keeping the machinery of French government functioning. One bad week, one failed entertainment, one moment where she couldn't pull off a miracle cure for royal melancholy, and half of Europe felt the consequences. Let me give you some specifics about this endless entertainment cycle. Morning concerts in the private apartments. Afternoon card parties with carefully selected guests who were guaranteed to amuse the king. Evening theatrical performances with Pompadour herself, often playing lead roles. Then maybe a midnight supper with witty conversation and the latest gossip from Paris. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, no vacations, no sick days, no sorry Louis, I'm just not feeling creative today. The show absolutely had to go on. She kept detailed notes on what worked and what didn't, which musicians could lift his spirits, which plays made him laugh, which courtiers were good for light conversation versus serious discussion, which topics to avoid when he was in certain moods. It was like she was running a psychological experiment with the King of France as her only test subject. And failure wasn't just personal embarrassment. Failure meant losing the most powerful position a woman could hold in 18th century Europe. The physical toll was brutal. Contemporary accounts mention Pompadour constantly fighting exhaustion, recurring illnesses, stress-related symptoms. She was burning herself out trying to be the human equivalent of Prozac for an incredibly powerful, incredibly moody monarch. And she couldn't delegate this stuff. Louis didn't want entertainment from random courtiers. He wanted it from her, personally, with that special combination of intelligence, wit, and genuine affection that had won her the position in the first place, but now amplified to an impossible degree. What's crazy is how she kept innovating. When the king got bored with traditional court entertainments, she invented new ones. When he lost interest in music, she switched to art projects. When parties felt stale, she redesigned the entire social calendar. She was constantly one step ahead of his moods, anticipating what might lift his spirits before he even realized he needed lifting. It was emotional labor on a scale that's hard to imagine. And she did it while looking effortlessly elegant and mysteriously powerful. This was the glamourless reality behind all that Versailles glitter. Being maîtresse-en-titre meant signing up for the most demanding customer service job in history. Your client was the King of France. Your product was happiness. And there was no calling in sick, no passing the responsibility to someone else, no saying figure it out yourself. Every single day, Pompadour had to wake up and somehow make magic happen for a man whose entire kingdom depended on his mood. That's the job nobody talks about. When the bedroom closed. Here's where Pompadour's story gets really fascinating. Around 1750, 5 years into her reign as official mistress, something changed. The physical side of her relationship with Louis XV ended, just stopped. And here's the crazy part. She kept her power for 14 more years anyway. This wasn't some gradual cooling off. This was a deliberate transformation that would prove sex was never really the job. What happened next rewrote the rules of how women could hold power at Versailles, and it started with her body giving out. Let's talk about why this happened. Pompadour had been through hell physically. 3 miscarriages with the king, that's 3 pregnancies that didn't make it, each one taking a toll. Then the health problems started piling up. Whooping cough that left her lungs permanently damaged, recurring bronchitis, spitting up blood regularly, headaches that lasted for days. Her body was telling her something her ambition didn't want to hear, and that something was about to force the most powerful reinvention in Versailles history. But here's what gets me about Pompadour. She didn't go down without a fight. When she realized her libido was basically gone, she went full medieval medicine mode. Truffles. Lots of truffles. Apparently they were supposed to be aphrodisiacs. Celery. Eating celery constantly. Vanilla. Somehow vanilla was supposed to help too. Can you imagine? The most powerful woman in France desperately eating celery and truffles, hoping to save her sex life. It didn't work. But what she did next? That definitely worked. She went to Louis XV with brutal honesty. This is around 1750, remember. She told him straight up that she had what she called a cold temperament. Basically, she wasn't feeling it anymore. Physically, emotionally, the bedroom part of their relationship was over. Now here's what should have happened according to every rule of Versailles. He should have dismissed her, found a new official mistress, moved her out of those connected apartments. That's how this system was supposed to work. But Louis XV didn't do that. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Louis XV essentially said, "Okay, we'll figure something else out." And they did. Pompadour transformed herself from lover to what she called friend of the king. Think about how radical this was. She literally invented a new category of relationship that had never existed at Versailles. She kept her apartments, kept her access, kept her political influence. But now their relationship was, what? Intellectual, emotional, whatever it was, it worked. For both of them. The genius of this arrangement becomes clear when you think about what Louis XV actually needed. Yeah, he needed physical companionship, but he could get that from petite maîtresses. Temporary affairs, what he couldn't replace was Pompadour's brain, her political instincts, her ability to manage his moods and depression, her network of contacts, her understanding of court dynamics. All of that had nothing to do with the bedroom, and all of that was about to become more valuable than ever. So they worked out a system. Pompadour would stay in her role as confidante, advisor, and emotional manager. She'd help him find and vet other women for the physical side. Think of her as head of human resources for the king's love life. I know that sounds weird, but it actually made sense. She understood what he needed. She knew how to spot women who might cause political problems, and she could manage the whole situation without jealousy because she didn't want that part anymore anyway. This arrangement lasted 14 years. 14 years where Pompadour held on to power without sleeping with the king. And during those 14 years, she became more politically influential than ever. She helped dismiss ministers, shaped foreign policy, corresponded with foreign heads of state, built the Petit Trianon, established the Sèvres porcelain factory, all while managing Louis XV's emotional state and helping him navigate his other relationships. It was like she became his unofficial chief of staff. What this proves is something revolutionary about power and relationships. At Versailles, in the 1750s, a woman figured out how to separate sexual access from political influence. She proved that her real value had never been her body, it was her mind, her understanding of people, her ability to manage complex situations and personalities. The bedroom door might have closed, but the door to real power, that stayed wide open, and she walked through it every single day. The impact on French politics was huge. Pompadour's new role meant she could focus entirely on policy and palace intrigue without the emotional complications of a sexual relationship. She became more strategic, more long-term in her thinking. Some historians argue this is when she became most dangerous because she had nothing left to lose personally. Her position was secure, her health was what it was, and now she could play pure politics. Louis XV essentially gave her tenure. And here's maybe the most important part. This worked because both of them were honest about what they actually needed from each other. No pretending, no trying to force something that wasn't there anymore. They redefined their relationship based on reality, not on what they thought it should be. In a world where everything was about appearance and protocol, they found a way to make something real work. That honesty, it kept them both in power for 14 more years. The power behind the throne. Here's what's wild about Pompadour. After 1750, the bedroom's closed. Louis barely touches her anymore. She's coughing up blood, exhausted from years of keeping him entertained. Any rational person would expect her power to vanish. Right? Wrong. This is when she becomes truly dangerous. Because now she's not the king's lover, she's his prime minister in everything but name, and she's about to prove that political power beats bedroom power every single time. 1757. The Comte d'Argenson thinks he's untouchable. He's the Minister of War, appointed by the king himself. But Argenson made a mistake. He crossed Pompadour. Maybe he questioned her influence. Maybe he blocked one of her projects. Doesn't matter. Within months he's out. Gone. Dismissed. And here's the kicker. Louis XV fires his own Minister of War, essentially because his former mistress wants it done. That's not pillow talk. That's raw political calculation. Foreign policy. That's Pompadour's domain too. She's pushing France toward an alliance with Austria. Austria, France's traditional enemy for centuries. The diplomats are horrified, but Pompadour sees the bigger picture. She's corresponding directly with Empress Maria Theresa, two women reshaping European politics, while their male ministers scramble to catch up. And this alliance? It's going to happen whether the old guard likes it or not, because when Pompadour decides, France decides. The Enlightenment's in trouble. Diderot and D'Alembert are working on their encyclopedia, but the church wants it banned. Dangerous ideas about reason and science. The court split. Conservatives want these philosophers silenced, but Pompadour steps in. She's backing them financially, protecting them politically. Why? Because she gets it. Knowledge is power, and a woman who rose from nothing to rule France understands that ideas can topple kingdoms or build them. The Petit Trianon. Pompadour's commissioning an entire palace. Not for herself, she'll be dead before it's finished. For the king. For future mistresses, maybe. The architect is Anne-Jacques Gabriel, France's finest, every detail chosen by Pompadour. Stone, gardens, proportions. She's creating architecture that will outlast her by centuries. Think about that. A former bourgeois girl designing palaces that royalty will inhabit for generations. That's not influence, that's immortality through stone and mortar. Sèvres porcelain. Sounds boring, right? Wrong. Pompadour's revolutionizing French luxury goods. She's relocating the royal porcelain factory from Vincennes to Sèvres, pouring royal money into making French ceramics rival Chinese imports. Why? Economics, national pride, but also strategy. When foreign ambassadors receive Sèvres pieces as gifts, they're holding French soft power in their hands. Pompadour understood that influence comes in many forms, even in delicate pink porcelain cups. Place de la Concorde. Today, millions of tourists cross this square in Paris. What they don't know, Pompadour shaped its creation. Originally Place Louis XV, designed to glorify the king, but Pompadour's fingerprints are all over the urban planning decisions, the architectural competitions, the final design choices. She's literally reshaping Paris. Centuries later, people walk through spaces she helped envision. Every step across that square is a step through her legacy. The diplomatic correspondence is insane. Pompadour's writing directly to foreign rulers, not as the king's representative, as herself. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria treats her as an equal. Frederick the Great mentions her in dispatches. Foreign ambassadors report to their governments about meetings with her, not just the king. She's conducting shadow diplomacy from her apartments at Versailles. This isn't a mistress playing politics. This is a head of state without the title. Court appointments, Pompadour's decision, military promotions, she weighs in. Tax policies, she's consulted. Ministers know that getting her support matters more than impressing the king, because she's the one who will still be whispering in Louis's ear tomorrow morning. The Duke of Choiseul owes his rise to foreign minister entirely to her backing. She's not just influencing policy, she's making careers and breaking them with a word. The old nobility hates this. Here's a woman who wasn't even born aristocrat, making decisions that affect the kingdom's future. They call her poison behind closed doors. But they also seek her favour desperately, because they understand the reality. Louis XV has essentially delegated governing to her. She's reading state papers, attending policy meetings, shaping France's direction. The Bourbon monarchy is being run by a former fish merchant's daughter, and she's better at it than most kings. This is power without precedent. Not Queen's power, which was ceremonial, not minister's power, which was delegated. This is something new, unofficial authority that's more real than most official positions. Pompadour proved that in the right hands, influence can be transformed into actual governance. She wasn't just the power behind the throne, she was the throne, in everything but name, and she did it all while dying slowly, one coughing fit at a time. Du Barry's impossible rise. Meet John Becue. Born in 1743, illegitimate daughter of a seamstress, no father in the picture, no money, no connections, no aristocratic blood whatsoever. In the rigid world of 18th century France, where your birth determined everything, this girl had absolutely nothing going for her. She should have lived and died in obscurity, maybe married a cobbler if she was lucky. Instead, she'd end up as the most powerful woman in France, sleeping in apartments connected to the king's bedroom by a secret staircase. How does that even happen? Picture 12-year-old Jean on the streets of Paris, selling trinkets and ribbons to anyone who'd buy them. Cold fingers, worn shoes, dodging carriages of nobles who wouldn't even glance her way. This wasn't charming street vendor stuff. This was survival. Her mother Anne stitched clothes for other people's children, while Jean hawked cheap jewellery to put food on the table. Zero glamour, just a kid trying not to starve. But here's what nobody saw coming. She was learning, watching, figuring out how wealth and power actually moved through the city. By 15, Jean had levelled up to hairdresser's assistant. Which sounds like progress, right? Well, sort of. She's still poor, still illegitimate, still nobody special. But now she's working in wealthy homes, seeing how rich women lived, talked, carried themselves. She's picking up their mannerisms without even realizing it. The way they held their hands, how they laughed, what they found amusing. It's like she was accidentally getting a masterclass in being upper class. Though at this point, she had no idea why any of that would matter. Next job, companion to a wealthy widow. Finally, steady work in a proper household. Jean's getting comfortable, thinking maybe she's found her place. Then she gets fired. Why? because she was too attractive. The widow's sons couldn't stop flirting with her, and Mama wasn't having it. So out goes Jean, back to the streets. But here's the thing, she'd gotten a taste of that life. Nice clothes, good food, being treated with respect. She wasn't going back to selling trinkets. She was going to find another way up. So what options does a beautiful, educated but not aristocratic woman have in 1760s Paris? Not many legal ones. Jeanne made a choice that would have shocked her mother. She entered the world of high-class prostitution. Not street walking. We're talking elegant salons, wealthy clients, silk gowns. This was a business, and she was treating it like one. She was 23 years old, stunning, and finally had access to the kind of men who could change her circumstances. But even she couldn't have imagined how dramatically those circumstances were about to change. Picture this scene. It's 1768. Jean, now calling herself Mademoiselle Long, is working for Jean-Baptiste du Barry, who runs an exclusive establishment. The clients are ministers, generals, wealthy merchants. She's learned French court etiquette, can discuss art and literature, knows how to charm powerful men. She's essentially completed her education in how to navigate elite society, but she's still a prostitute, still someone these men would never acknowledge publicly, still completely outside the system of real power, until one particular client changes everything. King Louis XV was 58 years old when he first saw 25-year-old Jean. Pompadour had died 3 years earlier. The king was lonely, bored, surrounded by court politics he was tired of managing. Then this woman appears, beautiful. Yes, but more than that, she was genuine, unpretentious. After decades of calculating courtiers, she was refreshingly real. She made him laugh, made him feel young again. And here's what's crazy. She had no agenda. She wasn't trying to advance her family or gain political power. She was just herself. The king was smitten, completely, totally infatuated. But here's the problem. Only aristocrats could be officially presented at court. Jean was nobody, a seamstress's daughter from the streets. So they arranged a marriage of convenience to Count Guillaume de Barry, a distant relative of her procurer. One day she's Mademoiselle Long, the next she's Countess de Barry. Overnight, this woman who used to sell ribbons on street corners had a title that gave her access to Versailles. The transformation was so sudden, it didn't seem real. Think about the impossibility of what just happened. In a society where your birth determined absolutely everything, where noble families traced their bloodlines back centuries, where a seamstress's daughter couldn't even speak to a duke without permission, Jeanne Bécu had just become the second most powerful woman in France. She went from selling trinkets to dismissing ministers, from dodging carriages to riding in them as crowds bowed, from worrying about her next meal to having the treasury fund her wardrobe. It was the kind of rise that simply didn't happen. But here's what made it even more shocking. Everyone knew exactly where she came from. This wasn't some carefully crafted lie about noble origins. Court gossips whispered about her past constantly. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters describing the king's mistress as a former prostitute. And Louis XV didn't care. He was so enchanted with her that he ignored every rule of French society. For a man who lived his entire life bound by protocol and tradition, this was revolutionary and terrifying to everyone else who depended on that system staying exactly as it was. Du Barry's rise reveals something crucial about power. Sometimes the most impossible journeys happen because someone refuses to accept that they're impossible. She never stopped believing she deserved better, never accepted that her birth defined her limits. From street vendor to king's favourite in 25 years. But here's what she didn't know. The higher she climbed, the further she'd have to fall. And the French Revolution was coming, with a very long memory about who had lived in luxury while the people starved. Her incredible rise was about to become an equally dramatic descent. The hastily arranged marriage. Here's the problem facing Du Barry and her handlers in 1768. Versailles had rules, strict ones. Only aristocrats could be formally presented at court. Only aristocrats could occupy the apartments. Only aristocrats could dine with the king. Du Barry, born Jean Bécu, daughter of a seamstress, street vendor turned prostitute, turned royal mistress. Not exactly blue blood material, but Louis XV wanted her at court. Officially, which meant one thing had to happen fast: she needed a title. Think about this situation. The King of France is infatuated with a woman who legally can't set foot in the formal palace rooms. She's living in borrowed apartments, seeing him in secret, while everyone at court whispers about the king's new obsession they can't officially acknowledge. This isn't sustainable. Foreign diplomats need to know who they're dealing with. Court protocol demands clarity. And Louis XV? He's done pretending this is temporary. Time to make Jean Bécu someone else entirely. Enter Count Guillaume du Barry. Perfect candidate for this peculiar job interview. Minor nobility, strapped for cash. And here's the key part. He's a relative of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, the man who'd been managing Jean's career in high-class prostitution. Family connections make everything easier. The Count needs money. The du Barry faction needs a title. And Jean? She needs to stop being Jean Bécu and become somebody Versailles can officially recognize. A marriage of pure convenience gets arranged. September 1st, 1768. The wedding happens fast. Real fast. Count Guillaume du Barry marries Jean Bécu in a ceremony that's basically a business transaction with religious window dressing. No romance, no courtship, no pretense this is anything but paperwork. The Count gets paid handsomely for lending his name. Jean gets instant aristocracy, and the king gets his mistress upgraded to countess status. One signature transforms everything. Well, almost everything. Her past doesn't disappear quite so easily. The new Countess du Barry arrives at Versailles in April 1769. Officially presentable now. Officially noble. The ceremony happens with all proper protocol. She curtsies to the royal family, receives her apartments, gets introduced to foreign ambassadors. On paper, she's legitimate aristocracy. In reality, everyone knows exactly what just happened. The court's not stupid. They watched this transformation happen in real time. But now they have to pretend it's normal. That's how Versailles works. Official fiction covering obvious reality. Here's what's wild about this whole arrangement. The Count who gave her his name, he basically disappears after the wedding, gets paid, provides the title, then lives quietly elsewhere, while his wife becomes the most powerful woman in France. She's technically married to him, but sharing a bed with the king. He's technically her husband, but has no contact with her whatsoever. It's the strangest marriage in French history. A legal technicality with a massive payoff for everyone involved. The court adapts. Sort of. Foreign diplomats start addressing her as Countess. She gets invited to state dinners, receives official correspondence, but the whispers never stop. Everyone knows Mademoiselle Long, the prostitute, just became Countess du Barry through a bought marriage. Her origins aren't hidden, they're just officially ignored. There's a difference. The transformation worked legally, but socially, the scandal follows her everywhere. Every curtsy comes with a smirk. Every formal introduction carries an implied wink. Marie Antoinette's wedding supper, May 1770. Picture this scene. The 14-year-old future queen sits at the royal table. Du Barry, now officially countess, sits there too. Same table, same formal protocol. The Dauphine stares at this woman. Everyone knows bought her title to sleep with her grandfather-in-law. The tension's thick enough to cut. This isn't just social awkwardness. It's a preview of the political warfare coming. Two women, two completely different ideas about legitimacy. Same royal table. The open secret becomes part of Versailles entertainment. Courtiers develop a whole coded language around Du Barry's transformation. They reference her recent elevation and new circumstances with straight faces while everyone understands the subtext. It becomes a game, how to acknowledge reality without stating it directly. The king pretends his countess arrived at court through normal aristocratic channels. The court pretends to believe him. Everyone's acting. Everyone knows everyone's acting. Classic Versailles theatre. But here's the thing about bought nobility in 18th century France. It's not actually that unusual. Rich merchants purchase titles regularly. Wealthy bourgeois families climb the social ladder through strategic marriages constantly. What makes Du Barry different isn't the transaction, it's the transparency. Usually these arrangements happen quietly over generations. Her transformation happened in months, in front of everyone, for obviously sexual reasons. The speed and obviousness made it scandalous, not the concept itself. By winter 1769, the arrangement's working perfectly on paper. Countess de Barry holds official receptions, corresponds with foreign courts, influences policy decisions. Her manufactured aristocracy functions exactly like real aristocracy, which raises uncomfortable questions nobody wants to ask out loud. If bought titles work the same as inherited ones, what makes nobility legitimate anyway? De Barry's fake Countess Act exposes how much of aristocracy is performance. That revelation makes her dangerous to more than just Marie Antoinette. The diamond necklace problem. Picture this. Du Barry at Versailles, wearing diamonds worth more than entire provinces. We're talking about jewels, so expensive they literally threatened to empty France's treasury. Not metaphorically. Actually, the royal accountants were pulling their hair out, trying to figure out how to pay for her necklaces, while the kingdom teetered on bankruptcy. This wasn't just extravagance anymore. This was financial suicide, dressed up in sparkling stones, and somehow nobody seemed willing to tell the king to stop. The most infamous piece, a diamond necklace that cost 1.6 million livres. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to about $15 million today. For one necklace, the thing was so heavy with diamonds that Du Barry needed help putting it on. It covered her entire chest and neck in a waterfall of stones. Meanwhile, French peasants were literally starving in the countryside. The contrast wasn't just tone-deaf, it was obscene. And Louis XV, he signed the bills without blinking. But the jewellery was just the beginning. Du Barry's gowns cost fortunes. Each dress required yards of the finest silk, intricate embroidery, and sometimes actual threads of gold woven through the fabric. She owned estates scattered across France, chateaux, gardens, art collections. Her apartment at Versailles was redecorated constantly with the most expensive furnishings money could buy. Every whim became a royal expense. Every desire became a national debt. The woman lived like she had access to infinite money, which she basically did. Then there was Zamor, Du Barry's personal servant, a young Bengali boy the king had essentially purchased for her as a living, breathing, exotic gift. Zamor dressed in silk turbans and jewelled clothing. He served her morning chocolate on golden trays. The optics were staggering. Here's a woman who rose from selling trinkets on the street, now owning another human being as a luxury accessory. The irony would prove deadly during the Revolution, but right now, in the 1770s, nobody was questioning these arrangements. Here's what makes this tragic. While Du Barry was commissioning new jewels, France was facing its worst financial crisis in decades. The 7 Years' War had drained the treasury. Taxes couldn't be collected efficiently. The American Revolution was bleeding money from royal coffers. And yet, the king kept signing off on diamond purchases. It was like watching someone buy champagne while their house burned down around them. The mathematics didn't work. The kingdom couldn't sustain this level of personal spending. Something had to break. How did Louis XV justify these expenses? In his mind, Du Barry's magnificence reflected royal power. A shabby mistress would suggest a weak king. So every diamond, every gown, every estate purchase became a matter of national prestige. The royal treasury treated her allowance like a diplomatic necessity. Her jewellery bills got filed under state expenses. It was creative accounting taken to its absolute extreme. The king convinced himself that bankrupting France was somehow patriotic. The logic was insane, but nobody dared challenge it. Court reaction was complicated. Publicly, nobles had to pretend this was normal. They'd compliment Du Barry's latest necklace while privately calculating the cost. Some courtiers started keeping track of her expenses, like a morbid game. Others worried about their own positions if the monarchy collapsed under debt. The smart ones began quietly moving money out of France, because anyone with basic math skills could see where this was heading. The spending was unsustainable. The reckoning was coming. They just didn't know when. The political implications were staggering. Du Barry's expenses became ammunition for the king's enemies. Foreign diplomats reported back about French royal extravagance, while the kingdom struggled financially. It made Louis XV look weak, frivolous, completely out of touch with reality. Every new jewel purchase was proof that the monarchy had lost its way. Opposition pamphlets started listing her expenses alongside France's growing debt. The woman who was supposed to enhance royal prestige was actually destroying it, but the spending continued anyway. Marie Antoinette watched all this with growing horror. The 14-year-old Dauphine understood basic economics. She could see that Dauphine's lifestyle was financially insane, but she was powerless to stop it. Worse, the French people would eventually transfer their anger about Dauphine's spending onto her, because when Louis XVI became king and refused to take a mistress, Marie Antoinette absorbed all the blame for royal extravagance, even though Dauphine had set the precedent. The irony was brutal and completely unfair. The broader context makes this even more disturbing. While Du Barry collected estates, French peasants were literally selling their children to pay taxes. While she commissioned new jewels, entire provinces faced famine. The disconnect between royal spending and national reality had become a moral crisis. Du Barry wasn't just living extravagantly, she was living as if the suffering of ordinary French people was completely irrelevant. The woman had become a symbol of everything wrong with absolute monarchy. She just didn't realize it yet. The consequences were inevitable. You can't bankrupt a kingdom to pay for one woman's jewellery collection without facing serious repercussions. Du Barry's diamond necklaces became symbols of royal corruption. Her estates became proof of monarchical excess. Even Zemmour, her beloved servant, would eventually testify against her during the revolution. The French people were building a list of grievances, and Du Barry's name was written all over it. The diamonds that made her feel powerful would ultimately help destroy the system that created her. The Queen's misfortune. May 1770. Versailles wedding supper. 14-year-old Marie Antoinette sits at her first official French court dinner as the new Dauphine. And there, glittering in diamonds and silk, sits Madame du Barry, the king's official mistress, at the bride's wedding feast. Can you imagine? The teenage Dauphine's face goes cold. This woman, this former street vendor turned countess, eating at her wedding table. The insult burns. What Marie Antoinette doesn't realize is she just made the most dangerous enemy at Versailles. The disgust is mutual. Du Barry sees this Austrian princess, this child, looking down at her like she's dirt. Marie Antoinette sees everything wrong with French morality sitting across from her. The silence stretches. Courtiers hold their breath. This isn't just personal awkwardness. This is two power centers about to collide. The young Dauphine refuses to acknowledge Du Barry exists. Du Barry smiles like a predator. Both women understand perfectly. This is war, and at Versailles, personal wars become political battlegrounds that can topple kingdoms. Within weeks, Factions form. Team du Barry versus Team Marie Antoinette. The Duke of Choiseul, the foreign minister, backs the Dauphine. He's been trying to place his own sister as Louis XV's mistress for years. Du Barry represents everything he opposes. Meanwhile, Du Barry's supporters include the king himself and anyone who profits from her influence. Nobles pick sides based on pure calculation. Who offers better access to power? The established mistress or the future queen? Choose wrong and your career at Versailles dies. Choiseul makes his move. He whispers to Marie Antoinette that she shouldn't speak to Du Barry, ever. It's beneath her dignity as future queen. Bad advice, but the Dauphine takes it. For months, she freezes Du Barry out completely. No acknowledgement, no polite nods, nothing. Du Barry seethes. Louis XV grows irritated. Court etiquette demands the Dauphine at least recognise the king's official mistress. Marie Antoinette's refusal isn't just rude, it's becoming a diplomatic incident that threatens French-Austrian relations. The standoff peaks at Versailles, January 1772, New Year's Day reception. Everyone's watching. Will the Dauphine finally speak to Du Barry? The room falls silent as Marie Antoinette approaches. Du Barry curtsies. The moment stretches. Then, Marie Antoinette walks past like Du Barry is invisible. The insult echoes through Versailles. Du Barry's face goes white. Louis XV is furious. Within months, Choiseul gets dismissed from his position. Du Barry wins this round, but she's creating an enemy who'll remember every slight when she becomes queen. Here's what Marie Antoinette doesn't understand about the mistress system. It's designed to protect queens. Think about it. When people hate royal policies or royal spending, who do they blame? The wicked mistress who corrupts the king. Not the innocent queen producing heirs. Pompadour absorbed decades of public fury for Louis XV's wars and taxes. Du Barry gets blamed for the king's financial disasters. Meanwhile, queens stay above the fray, clean, sympathetic. The mistress serves as a lightning rod, drawing criticism away from the royal marriage. Then Louis XV dies in 1774. Louis XVI becomes king at 20. And here's the plot twist. He doesn't take a mistress. Revolutionary concept, right? He's genuinely in love with Marie Antoinette. Wants a faithful marriage. Noble intentions, terrible political strategy. Because without a mistress to blame, all the public anger about royal excess lands directly on the queen, every expensive dress, every party, every diamond, no buffer, no scapegoat, just Marie Antoinette absorbing the full force of French public resentment. The irony is brutal. Marie Antoinette spent years despising Du Barry for corrupting French morality. Now she'd give anything for another Du Barry to exist, someone else to take the blame. The pamphlets that attack the Queen's spending? Under the old system, they'd target the mistress instead. The songs mocking royal extravagance, they'd focus on the king's lover, not his wife. Marie Antoinette becomes the villain in stories that used to have different villains. She's trapped in a role that mistresses traditionally played. Public opinion turns vicious. L'Autrichienne, they call her. The Austrian. Every financial crisis gets blamed on the foreign queen who doesn't understand French values, her gambling debts, her fashion choices, her private theatre at the Petit Trianon. Under Louis XV, this criticism would have landed on Pompadour or Du Barry. They were French. They could be dismissed if anger grew too strong. But you can't dismiss a queen. She's permanent, untouchable, which makes her the perfect target for rage that has nowhere else to go. By the 1780s, Marie Antoinette's reputation is destroyed. And here's the tragic part. Much of what destroyed her were problems that had always existed at Versailles. Royal spending, court excess, disconnect from ordinary French people. The difference? Previous generations had mistresses to blame. Marie Antoinette faces this criticism alone and unprotected. Louis XV's faithful marriage, meant to restore morality to the crown, accidentally created a public relations disaster. Good intentions, catastrophic consequences. The Queen needed a scapegoat, and didn't have one. The rivalry that began at a wedding feast reveals something darker about power and gender. Marie Antoinette won the battle against Du Barry, but lost the war for public opinion. She destroyed the institution that might have protected her. When revolution comes, the Queen faces guillotine alone, carrying all the blame that centuries of mistresses had shared among themselves. Du Barry had already been executed months earlier, both women victims of a system that used female bodies to absorb male political failures. The last chapter of Versailles was written in their blood. The Revolution's Revenge. December 1793. Paris is drunk on blood and vengeance. The guillotine has already claimed a king, a queen, and thousands of nobles. Now it's hunting the symbols of royal excess. The women who wore diamonds while peasants starved. The mistresses who lived in palaces while children died of hunger. And there's one name the revolutionaries particularly want to see on their list. Madame du Barry, the former royal mistress who rose from street vendor to countess. Her turn is coming. After Louis XV died in 1774, du Barry was immediately banished from court. Standard practice, the new king's wife didn't want reminders of the previous reign's scandals. So du Barry retreated to her estate at Louveciennes. Beautiful chateau, stunning gardens. She lived quietly there for almost 20 years, kept her head down, avoided politics. But when the revolution erupted in 1789, being quiet wasn't enough. Your past was your crime, and du Barry's past was spectacularly, dangerously royal. Here's what makes this betrayal so personal. Remember Zamor, du Barry's Bengali servant, the one Louis XV gave her as a gift? She'd raised him from childhood, educated him, treated him like family, but when revolutionary fever swept France, Zamor saw which way the wind was blowing. He joined the Jacobins, the radical faction demanding blood. And when they needed evidence against his former mistress, Zamor didn't hesitate. He testified against the woman who'd been his benefactor for decades. Zamor's testimony was devastating. He told the tribunal about du Barry's wealth, her jewels, her correspondence with émigré nobles who'd fled France and were now plotting counter-revolution. Some of this was true. Du Barry had indeed hidden valuables and maintained contact with exiled aristocrats. But Zamor embellished everything, made her sound like a spy plotting against the Republic. The tribunal ate it up. Here was proof that royal mistresses were enemies of the people. The charges against du Barry read like a catalogue of revolutionary grievances. Conspiracy against liberty, correspondence with enemies of the Republic, intelligence with foreign powers, dilapidation of state finances. That last one particularly stung because it was true. She had been spectacularly expensive. Her jewellery alone could have fed thousands. Her gowns cost more than most people earned in years. The revolution wasn't just executing a person, it was executing a symbol. Du Barry's final weeks in the Conciergerie prison were brutal. This was where they kept the condemned before execution. Marie Antoinette had died here just 2 months earlier. The conditions were deliberately degrading. Former countesses shared cells with common criminals. Du Barry, who'd once slept in silk sheets at Versailles, now lay on straw. The revolutionaries wanted these aristocrats to experience the poverty they'd ignored for centuries. Equality through shared misery. December 8th, 1793. The tumbril, that's the cart they used to transport the condemned, rolled through Paris streets toward the Place de la Révolution. Du Barry wasn't going quietly like Marie Antoinette had. She was weeping, pleading with the crowd for mercy. This wasn't dignity, this was terror, and maybe that's what made it so shocking. The other aristocrats had faced death with aristocratic composure. Du Barry faced it like anyone would, with desperate human fear. On the scaffold, Du Barry broke down completely. She begged the executioner for more time, just 1 more minute of life. She appealed to the crowd, asking why they wanted her death. What had she done to deserve this? The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. This woman who'd lived in unimaginable luxury while others starved was now pleading for the one thing money couldn't buy: more time. The crowd was torn between satisfaction and discomfort. The execution itself was swift. The guillotine was designed to be efficient, egalitarian. Rich and poor died the same way. But Du Barry's pleas had unsettled even the bloodthirsty crowd. Her terror was so raw, so human, it reminded them that this was a person, not just a symbol. Some witnesses later said her death marked a turning point. The moment when the revolution's appetite for blood finally began to sicken, even its supporters. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, justice for the woman who'd worn diamonds while they starved. Others stood silent. Her desperate pleas had made her human in a way the stoic royal deaths hadn't. This wasn't a queen accepting her fate with dignity. This was terror, pure terror, and it forced people to confront what they were really watching. Not justice, not politics, an execution. The killing of a woman whose crime was being in the wrong place when history turned violent. With Du Barry's death, the institution of the royal mistress died too. 3 centuries of semi-official lovers, political advisors disguised as companions, shadow governments run from perfumed apartments. The revolution had eliminated not just the people, but the system that created them. Zamor, he survived the terror and lived quietly afterward. Whether he ever regretted his betrayal, we'll never know. But the woman who'd raised him was gone, and with her, an entire world. Comparing courts, here's what's wild about the French system. It wasn't universal. Other European courts had royal mistresses, sure, but nowhere else turned it into such a formal institution. The maîtresse-en-titre was uniquely French. In England, completely different game. In the Ottoman Empire, another universe entirely. But when you compare them side by side, you realize just how bizarre the French made this whole arrangement. They basically created an official government position for the king's girlfriend. That's not normal. Let's see how everyone else handled it. The French system was weirdly bureaucratic. That's the only word for it. They had protocols, official apartments, diplomatic recognition. Foreign ambassadors knew they had to court the king's mistress if they wanted anything done. Compare that to England, where mistresses existed in the shadows. Take Barbara Palmer, Charles II's favourite in the 1660s. She had enormous influence, could destroy careers, made and unmade ministers. But officially, she didn't exist. No title related to the position. No apartments in the palace. Just raw, unacknowledged power operating behind closed doors. Barbara Palmer could bankrupt the treasury with her demands, influence appointments, even shape foreign policy. But she did it all through manipulation and pillow talk. No formal recognition whatsoever. When she fell from favour, poof, gone. No graceful transition, no pension, no continued role. The English system was all informal power with zero job security. Meanwhile, at Versailles, Pompadour kept her apartments and influence for 14 years after the physical relationship ended. The French had somehow invented tenure for royal mistresses. Think about how bizarre that is. Then there's the Ottoman system. Completely different universe. The harem wasn't just the Sultan's private quarters. It was a political institution. Hundreds of women, hierarchical structure, the valied Sultan at the top. But here's the thing. These weren't mistresses in the European sense. They were more like political players in a game where marriage to the Sultan was the ultimate prize. The favourites who caught the Sultan's eye could rise incredibly fast, but they operated within this enclosed system that European courts couldn't even comprehend. Ottoman favourites like Roxolana in the 16th century wielded enormous power. She corresponded with foreign rulers, influenced military campaigns, basically ran the empire when Suleiman was away. Sound familiar? But she did it from within the harem system, not through formal court appointments like French mistresses. And when she convinced Suleiman to marry her, that broke every rule. In the Ottoman system, the Sultan wasn't supposed to marry his concubines, but love made him break tradition. The French would have just given her an official title and called it Tuesday. What made the French system so unique was this weird middle ground they created. Not hidden like English mistresses, not enclosed like Ottoman favourites. The maîtresse-en-titre existed in this strange official-unofficial space. She had her own court within the court. Foreign diplomats had to pay their respects to her. She received official correspondence. She had her own household staff, her own budget, her own political agenda. It was like they took the informal power that royal mistresses had always wielded and decided to formalize it, bureaucratize love. Only the French. The apartments tell the whole story. At Versailles, the maîtresse-en-titre's rooms were connected to the king's chambers by a private staircase. Official location, official access, official recognition. In English palaces, mistresses met the king wherever they could arrange it. Secret meetings, borrowed rooms, constant uncertainty about their position. Ottoman favourites had their quarters in the harem, but that was a separate world entirely. The French created something new, a mistress who lived openly in the palace as an acknowledged part of the governmental structure. The protocol differences are fascinating. When foreign ambassadors arrived at Versailles, meeting Pompadour wasn't optional. It was part of the diplomatic process. She held audiences, received gifts, negotiated on behalf of France. Try that in England. Charles II's mistresses might influence him privately, but no foreign diplomat would dare treat them as official representatives. In the Ottoman system, while harem women wielded power, they didn't receive foreign dignitaries directly. The French somehow made the king's girlfriend a legitimate part of international relations. Absolutely unprecedented. Each system reflected its culture's approach to power and sexuality. The English kept things hidden because they were more concerned with appearance of moral propriety. The Ottomans integrated concubines into a formal imperial system, but kept them separate from public governance. The French, they just said screw it and made it semi-official. The maîtresse-en-titre was openly acknowledged, publicly funded, diplomatically recognized. It was honest in a way the other systems weren't. Cynical, maybe, but honest. They admitted what everyone knew. Mistresses had always had political power. What's remarkable is how each system worked for its specific context. English informality suited a culture that prized the fiction of moral monarchy. Ottoman formality within the harem suited an empire where polygamy was accepted. French semi-formality suited, well, France, a culture that could discuss anything, rationalize everything, and turn even love affairs into matters of state policy. Other courts had powerful mistresses. Only Versailles had a job description for the position. Only France would think to create an organizational chart that included the king's official girlfriend. By the 1780s, this comparison mattered. Marie Antoinette looked around and saw other queens dealing with royal mistresses through established systems. Instead, she faced something new, a king who refused to take a mistress out of genuine affection for his wife. Sweet, right? Except it left her exposed to all the criticism that mistresses traditionally absorbed. The English system was brutal but contained. The Ottoman system was formal but separate. The French system was weird but functional. When it disappeared, nothing replaced its protective function. Sometimes the strangest institutions serve purposes nobody fully understands until they're gone. Closing reflection. Here we are, end of our journey through Versailles. And honestly, what strikes me most isn't the scandals or the jewels, or even the politics. It's how these women occupied this impossible space. The maîtresse-en-titre position was like, imagine being officially unofficial, powerful but never secure, intimate yet constantly performing for an audience of thousands. They lived in this weird contradiction where everyone knew exactly who they were, but pretended the role didn't really exist. Think about what we've learned. These weren't just lovers hiding in the shadows. Du Barry was corresponding with foreign ambassadors. Pompadour was firing ministers. They had their own courts, their own agendas, their own political networks. When diplomats wanted to reach the king, they went through women applying makeup in public. That's not romance, that's statecraft. The bedroom was just where the real office happened to be located. The connection was never really about sex, and the precarity, God, the precarity of it all. One day you're the most powerful woman in France. The next day you're dead on a scaffold or banished to a convent. Du Barry went from street vendor to shadow queen to guillotine victim. Pompadour died exhausted at 42, still working to keep Louis XV entertained. They wielded incredible influence, but never owned it. It could disappear with a king's mood, a rival's whisper, or a revolution's fury. The advisor role, that's what really gets me. These women became the only people who could tell French kings the truth. Everyone else was too terrified or too invested in their own positions. But the mistress, she had this unique access where she could say you're being an idiot during pillow talk and somehow get away with it. She was confidante, therapist, and political strategist rolled into one impossible job description that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did. They served as human shields too. Think about it. When people hated royal policy or royal excess, where did that anger go? Not toward the king, not usually toward the queen, toward the mistress. She absorbed the criticism, the blame, the public fury that might otherwise destabilize the monarchy itself. Du Barry got called every name imaginable, while Louis XV remained somehow above it all. She was the lightning rod that kept the crown from getting struck. Their influence shaped the strongest and weakest moments of French monarchy. When Louis XV was melancholy and paralysed, Pompadour got him moving again. When foreign policy needed direction, these women were in the room where it happened. They steadied kings during crises, and sometimes caused the crises themselves, but they were always there, always present during the moments that mattered. The monarchy's emotional and political equilibrium often depended on these relationships working. Then Louis XVI changed everything. Not intentionally, but by choosing not to take a mistress, he broke a system that had worked for generations. Maybe he genuinely loved Marie Antoinette. Maybe he was trying to be moral, but he didn't realize what that role actually provided. It wasn't just about royal pleasure, it was about political protection, emotional management, and public blame deflection. Without a mistress to hate, people focused their anger elsewhere. Poor Marie Antoinette became the target for everything. The debt, the extravagance, the political failures, all of it landed on her, instead of getting filtered through a mistress first. She was called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, accused of treason, of bankrupting France with her shopping. Without a maîtresse-en-titre to absorb that hatred, the queen became vulnerable in ways previous queens never experienced. The system's absence created a dangerous vacuum. Louis XVI probably thought he was being virtuous, faithful, modern, but he inadvertently unbalanced an equilibrium that had kept French monarchy stable for centuries. The institution of royal mistress had evolved to meet specific political needs. When he eliminated it without replacing its functions, those needs didn't disappear, they just became problems without solutions. Sometimes good intentions create the worst consequences. This might be history's perfect example of that principle. As you reflect on these stories, remember these relationships were incredibly layered. A mistress wasn't just a woman having an affair. She was confidante, advisor, scapegoat, friend, therapist, and sometimes the most powerful person in France, who wasn't technically supposed to exist. She managed kings' emotions, shaped foreign policy, protected queens from criticism, and absorbed public anger that might otherwise topple governments. The complexity is staggering when you really think about it. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider how these women navigated impossible contradictions. Officially unofficial, powerful yet precarious, intimate yet performing for audiences of thousands. They created shadow governments from bedroom conversations and shaped European history through pillow talk. Their stories reveal how power actually works, not through grand declarations or formal titles, but through access, influence, and the courage to tell truth to power. Rest well, grateful that love today can finally be just love.